Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. My guest today is Elliot Felix, CEO of Brightspot Strategy. Brightspot's a consultancy that focuses on attracting and retaining students by improving the student experience, their spaces, services, and technology. He and his team have done this at multiple institutions, including MIT, NYU, NC State, and University of Virginia, and in the process touched over 1 million students. Elliot has just released a second book called The Connected College, and he joins me today to talk about the book and how higher ed institutions can improve their enrollment, retention, and graduation rates by redesigning the student experience for today's student by thinking about the student experience in a holistic way. Elliot, welcome back to the program.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Drumm.
I'm looking forward to a great conversation. Before we get there, how have you been?
Pretty good. You know, a couple things changing in higher ed. So I've been busy, like you. And I've been busy in addition to helping universities by day, working on a book and a companion podcast by night. But all good.
Very good. Well, we're going to talk about the book today. I'm excited to delve into it.
I thought we might. Yeah.
So give the listeners a little bit of background in case listeners don't remember it from the first time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm a student success author, speaker, and consultant that's been lucky enough to work with more than 100 colleges and universities to help them understand and improve the experiences that students have and how to make them more successful by looking at the spaces that students learn and live in, the services that support them, and the technology they use. That's really my mission is student success. So my first book was How to Get the Most Out of College, and that's sharing the evidence on how students succeed with students and families that we talked about last time. And my next book is really taking those lessons about how students succeed, and it's helping institutions work better together to make it happen.
How did you get into this area of student success?
Well, it's funny, as you hear about the student experience, you hear, gosh, what students do in the classroom is important, but so is what they do out of the classroom. And I'm like living proof of that because I like to say I've been helping students since I was one. And I was involved in student government as an undergrad, and in grad school, caught the bug again. And I went to grad school at MIT and had an amazing experience. During a time of leadership transition, there were some things that students felt like we could improve. And so we got together and we did the benchmarking, we did a survey, we did town hall meetings, focus groups. We kind of defined the problem, brainstormed solutions, and then we went to the new dean, and she was delighted that we weren't just coming to complain, but we actually had some ideas, had some solutions. They were prioritized among the student body. And we made a real difference. We increased the pay of TAs. We restructured the course schedule so that it was easier to collaborate and cross-enroll. We really elevated the thesis as a capstone project. And as I think about my work as a strategic consultant to 100 plus colleges and universities, it's actually not that different. We're doing those kinds of activities to really understand what's working, what isn't, what's missing, and then work together to change the strategy, to change the space, to change the services, to change the systems, and make things better for students.
How did you get your perspective of holistic or systems thinking?
Well, it's funny. I think the ideas that have the most power are the ones where it's impossible to unlearn them, right? So it's like Freud's theory of the unconscious or Darwin's theory of evolution. Like once you know those, you can't see the world the way you did before. And design is kind of like that for me, where my background is in design, and I sort of can't help but see the world through the lens of design as this amazing way to imagine a better future together and to understand people and to make connections and think holistically and create together and prototype and test and pilot and iterate. And so that's really my ethos and my approach, is using design thinking to enable student success. And it's served me well, and certainly my clients as well.
Yeah. What did you major at while you were at MIT?
In architecture and design.
Okay. So that definitely, to do it and do it right, you have to be able to look at the whole perspective.
Yeah, I think you have to see the parts in the whole, and you have to see how they're changing, and you have to see how they affect people. And it's interesting, when I went to MIT 20 years ago, I went there really because of its technical exploration and its reputation. And I went in an architect, and I came out a designer and a strategist with a much deeper appreciation, not just for the technical side of things, but for the human side of things. And I realized places are for people, and so are technology platforms, and so are events and academic programs. And design was that kind of through line to be thinking holistically and to solve problems for people.
I understand, having flown airplanes, there's multiple systems, but if you want to keep the airplane flying, all of those systems have to work together. And that's where I got my grounding in that type of thing.
Nice. Did you do, OODA loops? That's one of my favorite aviation concepts.
OODA loops?
Observe, orient, decide, act.
Oh, no, it was just, immediately you see what was going on and you just did what you needed to do.
Well, I've heard that acronym for the way pilots think. And people have talked about that as like a management theory, that all teams can work that way. And the quicker you can observe, orient, decide, and act, like the better pilot you are, but also, the better consultant or the better professor or the better administrator you are. So
that's the first time I've heard the term, but, it makes a lot of sense.
Maybe I made it up in a dream world. I don't know.
You may have. Who knows?
Yeah.
Anyway, your new book, The Connected College, it's a holistic approach to running a university with the end in mind, student success.
Yeah. I mean, that's, to use your plane analogy, all the systems need to work together. And I think in my consulting work, I've found places where it does and places where it doesn't. And I really wanted to create an encouraging evidence-based playbook for breaking down silos so that students succeed. And so those systems are working better together. And so, we're going from great to awesome.
So in your book, it's how systems can work together. Obviously, getting students connected to careers is critical. Partnering with industry is all part of it. What are those connections? Because you talk about those in the book. What are those connections?
Some of the key ones in the book, I think it starts with belonging. So you have to feel connected to a community. And it might be through an affinity space or an identity space, mentoring, alumni services. We did a project for NYU that I think was really fun, to create these spaces that used to be these kind of drab rows and rows of computers, technology centers, and we created places where people could, the sort of tagline was connect and create. And so students were better connected to each other because they're working in teams on projects that make an impact. Another one is support services, right? Where you want to connect students with support to succeed. And it might be writing, tutoring, it could be advising. And I think that's really about meeting students where they are. We do a lot of work, for instance, turning libraries into student success hubs that bring together all kinds of different services. We did a project at UVA where it was like, how do you co-locate different advising functions so students can get advice on career, finance, study abroad, mindfulness, whatever it might be, so that they can better succeed. And another connection is connecting coursework to careers, right? Things like experiential learning, where students are doing real world projects that make an impact. And that requires another connection, which is internal collaboration, where the career office, the alumni office, the teaching and learning center, they're all working together, and you're partnering with industry, which is, another kind of connection. So I think at a connected college, students feel a sense of belonging. They connect to the support services to help them succeed. Coursework leads to careers, and everybody's working together internally and externally to make it happen.
Those are great ways of looking at it. And I always remember from studying systems theory and systems thinking at graduate work, you're looking for the levers. What are the levers that you can throw that are going to make large impacts? But before we get into those, there's barriers that you see at institutions. Org structure would be one of them. What are some of the barriers that you have to get past?
Well, one is, I think it's sort of a blessing and a curse, but higher ed has sort of deeply embedded in the culture and in the DNA is this idea of access and meeting students' needs, faculty needs, alumni needs, which I think is great. But unfortunately, the tried and true playbook for meeting those needs is usually to add stuff. So there's a new need, you're recruiting different kinds of students, your adult learners as well as 18 to 21-year-olds. You have more transfer students, you have more first-gen students, recruit more veterans. So you create a transfer student center and a veteran student center and a first-gen student center. And what do you do if you're a first-gen veteran student who transfers? Right. So I think we just keep adding and adding and adding and adding, all with the best intentions, but it creates experiences that aren't seamless and it creates costs that aren't sustainable. So I think that additive culture, we've got to break that cycle so we don't just keep adding and adding and adding and making things more complicated and costly and confusing. I think part of the way we break the cycle is better strategy, which is another kind of barrier. I think everybody has a strategic plan, but very few have an actual strategy where they're making real choices about where to win and how to play. And so we're kind of stuck in this cycle of do more with less. But I actually want people to focus so they can do less with more and have more resources to do the things they're focusing on. And I think the last big barrier is siloed structures. I opened the book talking about a university that has a writing lab and a writing center, which sounds like an apocryphal story, but everybody's got their version of it. I talked to somebody the other day and they've got a faculty enrichment center and a faculty development center in the same building on 2 different floors.
What's the difference?
Exactly. So,
besides the word enrichment development.
And what's the difference between a writing center and a writing lab? There is none. It's just one is in
Shouldn't be.
Elliot Hall and the other is in Drumm Hall. And these siloed structures, they beget separate spaces. They beget redundant systems, right? Maybe Drumm's writing center uses a different system to book appointments and book space and manage the relationship than Elliot's writing lab. Now, all of a sudden, we've got 2 spaces, we've got 2 systems. The data doesn't talk to each other. And so I think if we can kind of break the cycle of adding, and look to collaborate, cooperate, consolidate, we can use strategy that focuses us and we can rethink our structures, we can help students succeed.
Easier said than done, though, because a lot of these things, for example, you've got student support. And when an institution gets big enough, it gets moved away and out of academic affairs to be its own division. So they end up working autonomously and sometimes without consideration for where the students are, which is in academic affairs. Same kind of thing with advising. Many times they'll put advising within the college or the school versus an overall group. Talk about that. How do you bring those together to where they are truly shared services and they're specialized enough that they can deal with different majors, et cetera?
Well, I think a good starting point when you've got these separate structures or you've got this very diffused approach is creating a shared understanding of the student, because like silos don't work for student success, and that will lead people toward more cooperation and collaboration. Also, when you start sharing data on who your students are, then you can start sharing data on how you're helping them and how well it's working. And I think that also can help. And I think sometimes things need to be restructured and you rethink the balance of what's centralized and what's distributed. Sometimes there isn't an appetite for a reorg, and it's more about better coordination. Like one of the stories that I talk about in the book, I wasn't involved in this, but I certainly admire it, is Purdue, I think, has made amazing strides in how effectively they communicate internally and with students. And one of the ways they did that is they recognized that marketing and communications is such a diffuse subject. You've got it in every school, you've got it central, you're talking to families, you're talking to prospects, you're talking to current students. And so they created the Purdue Communicators Council, where there's regular meetings, there's templates, there's best practices. So we don't have to reorg everybody who's doing comms, but we can get those people to talk to each other more regularly, use the same templates, use the same brand, share best practices, lessons learned, scale things up. So I think there's a variety of strategies, but it starts with understanding the student, sharing the data, and then looking for ways to work better together formally and informally.
That makes perfect sense. One institution I was involved with, they had what they call Student One Stop, SOS. And in that group, which was a fairly large group, they had specialization per majors, but it kept the student advisors centralized. They had finance people in the group. And the nice thing was, many times what I've seen in colleges and universities is when a student comes in and says, oh, we don't deal with that, and they push it over to another group. It all stayed there. You had the same point of contact that you talked always, and that one person made sure you got through the process.
Yeah, I think one-stops are a great approach, digitally and physically to doing that. It's also a good example of you can kind of integrate the front end and then specialize the back end. So what happens a lot with one-stops is you get frontline staff that are cross-trained, right? So they can answer a question about enrollment or registration or financial aid or student accounts. And they can answer, say, 80% of those questions that cut across, but eventually there's going to be some super obscure, complicated something about a loan policy for an international returning student, and then that gets referred to a specialist. But that's the other thing that I think can spark collaboration is when you you mine the data on your transactions. So not just what, who students are and what they need, but how you're helping them. You often uncover that a lot of things are related and you find opportunities for cross-training. It might be among students in a peer-to-peer delivery model, or it might be your frontline folks. But I do think there are ways to better coordinate, consolidate, co-locate, but it's not a magic wand. It doesn't fix everything instantaneously.
Really? Everybody wants that silver bullet, baby.
Otherwise, they'd all be doing it, I guess.
And we'd be out of work.
Yeah. Well, that'd be okay. If I achieve my own obsolescence, then we got a lot of students succeed in it. I'd be happy with that.
Good point. Good point. So collaborate and consolidate is critical, especially with org structures, getting people to work across boundaries. Agility is always one thing that higher ed struggles with, especially when it comes to shared governance. Talk to that, because higher ed is big on shared governance, which I think is a good thing. But at the same time, many times the governance structures, whether it be the trustees or the internal faculty shared governance, slows things down.
Yeah. I mean, I think governance is neither good nor bad. It all depends on its execution, right? And I think the good governance is where you're intentional about what decisions to make, how you're getting input, how you're sharing the results, how you're tracking the progress. And I think a lot of people have a knee-jerk reaction that like more meetings and more committees and more input is better. But more isn't necessarily better. Sometimes more is just more. And I think if you're really focused, then you can get input. You can get lots of input, but still move quickly. We did the IT governance process not too long ago for Colorado State. And it really came down to thinking through what are the big technology investments? Where do we need input? And now, how do we organize groups that provide regular input on those decisions? Maybe some are about infrastructure and some are about learning and others are about research and others are about student life. And once you have those defined areas, you can organize groups. Those groups can meet regularly, so the conversations and the consensus can build over time, and you can move swiftly. I think, to me, it's like governance is sort of like the open office, right? They're like great examples of open office that are intentionally designed and people have lots of choices and there's a lot of variety of spaces, some open, some enclosed. And then they're like terrible cube farms, right? And there's terrible governance where people are drowning in committees, and there's great governance where they're really focused and strategic and at the same time decisive and transparent and everybody's engaged.
One of the things that we typically see is the best institutions as far as shared governance. Board governance in some ways is very different because boards should be setting direction, holding people accountable, et cetera. When you get to the shared governance piece, that's where you get the faculty involved, and faculty like to, study things, et cetera, which is a good thing. The institutions that I find are the most effective are those that have an overall policy for shared governance that reinforces what we call a RACI model: responsible, accountable, consult, and inform, so that you follow that process and it makes so much more sense.
Yeah, I think that's a RACI model is a great way to do it because you're defining their responsibilities. And what I love about a RACI or homegrown models, whatever it may be, is you're also avoiding the micromanagement, because I think the micromanagement is also sometimes how things get bogged down and you lose speed. And to me, it comes back to like Andrew Carnegie, right? Leadership is doing the right things and management is doing things right. And I think people get those conflated, and then you can have a lot of people spending a lot of time agreeing on something which is actually the wrong thing to do. One of the really interesting tidbits that I found in the book for the chapter on board governance, where I interviewed this amazing guy named Drumm McNaughton. You should meet him at some point. I looked at I think it's the AAC&U has an award for shared governance. And I was looking at the past award winners of last 20 years. And I'm looking at the list, and about half the institutions, I don't even recognize the names. And then I start looking into these institutions, and a bunch of them have closed. So they got a lot of people agreeing on a strategy that tanked the institution. So it's not just all about building consensus and everybody agreeing. It's not just about doing things right. You got to do the right things. You got to have the strategy too.
Absolutely. And that comes together with really the two final points on this is strategic planning is to provide focus and a shared vision. And then the change management is how you implement it.
Yeah, only you can't call it change management because nobody wants to be handled. I think that's one of my lessons in higher ed consulting adventures is you don't call it digital transformation. You don't call anything a transformation because then you just get everybody worried and it sounds hard and expensive. And then the other is you don't call it change management. Think of implementation science, next steps, whatever it might be. But yeah, I think you really have to think carefully about what's the change, and then you have to do some kind of change readiness assessment. What's going to inhibit or enable this change? You know, if the change is a new technology system or a new space that's going to, if we take the one-stop example, what's going to hold people back? A sense, their departmental identity. Are they using different systems? Are they in disparate spaces? Then you need to design a change program where through communication, learning, development, experience, exposure, people can get over those barriers. But I think it is really critical and often overlooked. There's a whole section in the book on change management and all the different change models out there from Cotter and Lewin and more, good old ADKAR. So, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because it's really critical, as is, the plan that helps you focus. And I think most institutions have a strategic plan, but very few have a strategy where they're at, where they're making real choices about where to play and how to win, to use the Roger Martin definition.
I think you're absolutely right that the challenge is let's throw it all up there on the board. We don't have to make hard decisions. It's just a quote guideline instead of this is what we're going to be executing. Yeah. You've got to make the tough decisions when it comes to finances because you can't afford everything and you don't want to afford everything because not everything is right.
Yeah. And I know one thing you really emphasize in your strategic planning process, and I wholeheartedly agree, is tying it, at least at some level, to budgeting. Because then otherwise your budget is your de facto strategic plan. You've got this document that takes you a year to create, and it basically says, we love apple pie, excellence, innovation. And then the actual decisions about what we're going to do and not do are made by the CFO in some corner somewhere when it's time to do the budgeting. But if you can knit the two together and then tie your decisions to your resources, then it works much better. And you kind of have to see the plan as a series of choices.
You said it very well. It is a series of choices. And the process that good strategic planners use is building a shared vision on the way through by involving stakeholders, top down, bottom up, consensus building around the right direction. The core planning team, the executive team, doesn't abdicate their responsibility on making the tough decisions. You put a budget behind it, and then you put an implementation plan in place so that it does, in fact, get implemented.
Yeah. And I think in terms of the top, you're absolutely right. It's top down and bottom up. I think it's also inside out and outside in. I think what some folks forget, they look internally or they do a kind of a cursory SWOT analysis, but bringing your partners into the planning process, like who are the key companies in the community that you have a relationship with or you're trying to build a relationship with? Because ideally, those are companies that are hiring your grads, that are sponsoring consulting projects so that your students can do real world projects. They're sending their execs back for executive education. They're partnering on research. Maybe they're even providing services that you need. I know like Quinnipiac has a really cool partnership with a health system where, they're providing healthcare and then they're also providing a talent pipeline because they're hiring the grads. So I think you really have to involve those key, could be some peer institutions and a consortia, but I think look inside out and outside in too.
Yeah. You've heard me talk about Russell Lowry Hart when he was at the Amarillo College, and they had these kind of partnerships with outside social services. I mean, they took their retention numbers, their persistence numbers, graduation, they tripled or quadrupled them. I mean, from 14% up to 65, 80% in some cases. Because of these partnerships, that when a student had a challenge in going through, especially the type of students that they were recruiting, first gen, low SES, et cetera, they would have challenges going through. They had the services there to be able to scaffold what needed to be done.
Yeah. And I think there's lots of cases where partners can do things better than you can. And I think we sometimes have this knee-jerk reaction that like markets and missions conflict. But I think there's room to partner with the private sector. There are things they can do better than you can yourself because they've got scale and because there's a kind of a network effect, right? Where all of a sudden you can benefit from them having done it with 100 other institutions and you don't have to reinvent the wheel and you get expertise and efficiency in one. There's a section of the book on partnerships as well, because I think that's like change management. That's one of these big ideas that I think is everybody's job.
Mm-hmm. What impressed me the most about the book was the holistic approach that you took. It wasn't, student services needs to do this. It's like student services needs to be involved with enrollment, with recruiting, all of those things. You look at it, the college as connected, hence the title. I really like that. But also, too, not only connected, but you look at it as a whole entity, systems thinking. Kudos
to
thank you for that.
Thank you very much. Yeah, each chapter is kind of a function of the university. So there's academics and athletics and advancement and career, IT, facilities, governance, student affairs, academic support, libraries, and and then an intro that sets the tone and a conclusion that guides you, that gets you started. And each chapter starts off with a profile of a higher ed innovator. So you get a sense of somebody who's leading a connected college or university or the function within one, has 3 big ideas for transformation, and then has a bunch of tactics about who you can work with to make it happen. So I tried to structure it and find those connections without propagating or propping up the silos we've got, because I'm very much hoping I can help people break some of those down.
Well, if they read your book, they certainly will be, a good start. So
thank you.
I want to thank you for being on the program. I've enjoyed our conversation.
Me too.
We spent a lot of time on what colleges need to do to get there, but let's summarize it. 3 takeaways for presidents and boards. What do they need to do to become a connected college?
So I think a strategic plan that makes choices on where to play and how to win, that provides focus. So break this cycle of doing more with less, and we get in the mindset of how do I do less with more? How do I have more resources for the fewer things I'm focusing on? Second, I think it is time to consolidate spaces and services and systems. I think we've got to curb the digital sprawl where there's a new tool or system for everything, and that system begets more training, more support, more communication. We got to end the everything gets a new space and consolidate so that people can work better together and the costs are sustainable. And I think the last thing is really a cultural thing, which is really about reshaping or rethinking your relationship to risk. Because I think a lot of leaders are worried about the future, and I get it because times are uncertain. But you might go into a meeting thinking about, what do I have to stop so that it doesn't have these negative consequences to manage the risks? But if you go into the meeting saying, let me flip the script on that and say, what can I say yes to so that we're moving forward, we're making some progress, however small it might be, I think that's really healthy and really helpful because it's motivating for the teams because progress is what drives us all. And then you can move into this kind of prototyping and piloting mindset. And that's what design thinking is all about. Instead of aiming for perfect, aim for good enough to try. And that can be a real unlock to move some of these things forward.
Those are great takeaways. Thank you. Always take into account the culture, what you've got, because a lot of times the culture needs changing.
Absolutely.
So what's next for you?
Well, the book is coming out in July, and I'm very much excited for people to get their hands on it and then roll up their sleeves and start breaking down silos so students succeed on their campus. And I'm excited to keep doing the work with innovative and interesting institutions that are really focused on transformation, and whether it's, working with industry in an innovation district, or whether it's adopting active and experiential learning on and off campus. That's what gets me up every day. And in the fall, there's going to be a book tour centered on a variety of academic libraries across the country. So I'm excited to do those, where there'll be a book club and a workshop and a talk, and getting folks in a position where they can make progress.
Very good. Well, thank you again so much for being on the program, and thank you for a copy of the book. I've thoroughly enjoyed reading it, and I wish you all the best with it. Where are you going for your book tour, first stop?
It might be Cambridge, Mass. We'll see.
Well, that would be a good place, considering you've got ties to MIT, so.
Yeah, well, actually, I'm wearing my MIT shirt. Listeners can't see, but I'm wearing my MIT shirt today.
I was wondering what that was.
Yeah, the logo looks like it comes from the future, which I think is appropriate.
There you go. There you go.
Thanks again, sir.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure, Elliot. Take care. Thanks for listening today, and a special thank you to my guest, Elliot Felix, CEO of Brightspot Strategy. Elliot, it was a pleasure having you back on the show. I look forward to the next time our paths cross. To my listeners, thanks again for listening. See you next week.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode, at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.